I am 92 years old. For 30 years, I have kept a secret that weighs heavier than any granite cornerstone I ever laid. In my lap right now, resting on these hospital sheets that smell like bleach and old lemons, is a piece of dark slate about the size of a dinner plate. It's rough on the edges, chipped from a larger vein of rock, but the surface is smooth where thousands of thumb strokes have worn it down. Scratched into the center is a crude drawing of a stick figure lying horizontal, surrounded by a box, with a jagged line representing a mountain above it. This slate is the only contract I ever signed that actually mattered. It isn't a deed to a house or a marriage license, though I've had both of those in my time. This is a promise between two old men who didn't speak the same language but understood the same pain. I'm going to die in a few days. Maybe less if the fluid in my lungs keeps rising. And I need to tell someone where the cave is. Not so you can go find it, but so you know why? The rock slide on the north ridge of the Olympic Peninsula looks a little too deliberate. My name is Vernon Kowalski. Most people call me Vern. I spent 40 years of my life as a stonemason, building retaining walls, chimneys, and foundations for the wealthy folks moving into Seattle and Tacoma. I understood stone. I knew that if you rush the foundation, the whole house comes down 10 years later when the ground settles. I knew that mortar is just a suggestion, but gravity is the law. You respect the weight of the material, or it crushes you. I applied that same logic to my life. I built a solid life with my wife, Doris. We bought 60 acres of timberland, way out past the paved roads. In 1968, planning to retire there, we built the cabin ourselves, hauling river stones for the hearth one by one. I thought we had built something that could weather any storm, something permanent. But cancer doesn't care about your foundation. It eats the house from the inside out. By the winter of 1993, the doctors told us there was nothing left to do but manage the pain. Doris died on a Tuesday in March of 1994. The ground was still hard from the frost, creating a crust of mud that cracked under your boots. I didn't hire a funeral home. Doris wanted to be on the property, up on the little rise that looked west toward the Pacific, even though you couldn't see the ocean through the Douglas firs. I dug the grave myself. It took me 2 days. I was 62 years old then, strong from a lifetime of lifting rock. But my hands shook the whole time. It wasn't the physical labor. It was the finality of it. Every shovel of dirt I threw over my shoulder felt like I was hollowing out my own chest. I lined the bottom of the grave with flat river stones, fitting them together tight. No gaps. It was the last thing I could build for her. I wanted her to rest on something solid. We buried her in a simple pine box I'd made in the shed. There was no preacher, just me and the wind coming off the mountain. After I filled the hole back in, I placed a large, unpolished piece of granite at the head. I hadn't carved her name into it yet because I couldn't bring myself to take a chisel to it. I felt that if I carved the dates, it would make it real. I went back to the cabin, sat on the porch in my rocking chair, and opened a bottle of cheap whiskey. The silence in that valley was usually my favorite thing. The kind of quiet that lets you think. But that night, the silence felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on my eardrum. I drank until the edges of my vision went fuzzy and my hands stopped shaking. I sat there watching the sun go down, waiting for a heart attack or a stroke to take me out. I didn't want to wake up the next morning. I had spent 40 years being half of a whole. Without Doris, I was just a pile of rubble waiting to be hauled away. I woke up 2 days later with a headache that felt like a sledgehammer behind my eyes. Primera ma de coffee black and thick. The way Doris hated it, and forced myself to walk up the hill to the grave. I needed to check the settling. Fresh dirt sinks, and I wanted to make sure the mound was still shaped right. As I crested the ridge, I stopped dead. The dirt had been disturbed. It wasn't the chaotic scratching of a coyote or a bear digging for a meal. It was deliberate. The soil had been smoothed over, patted down with immense pressure. I felt a surge of rage so hot it almost blinded me. I thought it was kids. Maybe hikers who had wandered off the trail and decided to mess with a fresh grave for kicks. I ran back to the cabin, ignoring the stiffness in my knees, and grabbed my .30-06 rifle from the rack above the door. I loaded it with trembling fingers, spilling a few rounds on the floor. I marched back up that hill, ready to kill. I didn't care about laws or consequences. This was my property, and that was my wife. The morning fog was still clinging to the trees, thick and gray, making the forest look like it was underwater. I reached the clearing, breathing hard, the rifle stock pressed against my shoulder. I scanned the tree line, looking for movement, looking for a trespasser. That's when I saw the flowers. On top of the mound of fresh earth, someone had placed a dozen stalks of foxglove. They weren't just thrown there, they were arranged in a circle, the purple bells facing outward. Foxglove is poisonous if you eat it, but it was Doris's favorite flower. She had spent years trying to get it to grow in the shade of the cabin. I lowered the rifle a few inches, confused. No hiker would take the time to arrange flowers. I heard a sound then, coming from the edge of the clearing where the fir trees were thick. It was a low, vibrating noise, like rocks grinding together deep underground. I swung the rifle toward the sound. A shape detached itself from the shadows. My brain couldn't process the scale of it at first. It stood on two legs, but it was wide. Impossibly wide. Covered in fur that was the color of wet bark and dark iron. It had to be 7 feet tall. Maybe more. It was kneeling in the ferns, watching me. I should have been terrified. I should have fired the weapon. But the creature wasn't looking at me with aggression. It was looking at the grave. It let out that sound again. The long, mournful keen that rose and fell like a siren. It was a sound of grief. I knew that sound. I had been making it inside my own head for 3 days. The creature turned its head slowly and looked at me. Its face was dark, skin like cured leather, with deep wrinkles around the eyes and mouth. The eyes were amber, set deep under a heavy brow, and they looked wet. I realized with a jolt that stopped my heart that this thing was crying. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a monster. It was an old man, or the creature equivalent of one. His muzzle was gray, and the fur on his shoulders was thinning. He looked at the rifle in my hands, then looked back at the flowers. He raised one massive hand, palm open, and patted the air gently. A gesture of calming. He pointed a long, dark finger at the grave, then touched his own chest, right over the heart. The message was so clear, it felt like he had spoken it aloud. I know her. I miss her too. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a minute. My arms started to ache from holding the rifle up. The adrenaline that had fueled my rage was draining away, leaving me cold and empty again. This creature had evidently been watching us. For how long? Years. Had he watched us build the cabin? Had he watched Doris hang laundry on the line, singing along to the radio, the realization didn't scare me. It made me feel incredibly small. I lowered the rifle completely, letting the barrel point at the mud. The creature Solomon. I named him later, because he looked like a judge sitting on a bench didn't move. He just held my gaze to widowers standing in the mist, acknowledging the hole in the ground between us. I didn't tell him to leave. I turned around and walked back to the cabin, my back prickling with the sensation of being watched. I sat on the porch and unloaded the rifle. Ejecting the shells one by one, they made a hollow clatter on the wood floor. I went into the pantry. Doris had spent the last summer canning peat. She had put up 50 jars, worrying about a winter she wouldn't survive to see. I took a jar off the shelf. The glass was cool and dusty. I could see the peach halves suspended in the syrup, golden and perfect. I walked out to the fence post that marked the edge of the yard, about 50 yards from the porch. I set the jar down on the flat top of the post. I didn't know if these things ate peaches. I didn't know if he was still there, but it felt like the only thing I could do. A peace offering, or maybe just an offering to the only other soul who seemed to care that Doris was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark living room with the curtains drawn back, watching the yard. The moon was behind the clouds, so it was pitch black out there. I listened. The woods are never truly silent. There's always the wind in the needles, the snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl. But around 3 a.m., the usual noises stopped. It was like someone had thrown a blanket over the world. I heard the heavy, rhythmic crunch of weight on gravel. It was a slow, deliberate cadence. Step, pause. Step, pause. It sounded like a man walking with a limp. I held my breath, gripping the arms of my chair. The footsteps stopped near the fence. I heard a soft clink of glass, then a wet suction sound, like a lid being twisted off. Then, silence when the sun came up. I waited until the light hit the fence post before I went outside. The jar was there. It was empty. But it wasn't just empty. It had been cleaned, not licked clean, but washed. There were droplets of water still clinging to the inside of the glass, and a small ring of wetness on the wood where it sat. He had taken it down to the creek, rinsed it out, and brought it back. I picked up the jar. The lid was sitting neatly beside it, unbent. He had unscrewed it. I ran my thumb over the rim of the glass. No chips. He had hands big enough to crush a man's skull like a grape. But he had handled Doris's canning jar with the delicacy of a surgeon. That morning, I went to work on the retaining wall behind the shed. The winter rains had washed out some of the soil, and the stones were starting to bulge. I needed to reset the foundation. It was hard work for a man my age, lifting 60-pound river rocks and mixing mortar in a wheelbarrow. I worked because if I stopped, I would start thinking about the empty bed inside the cabin. Around noon, I felt that prickle on my neck again. I didn't look up immediately. I kept troweling the mortar, smoothing the joint. When I finally turned my head, he was there. He was sitting at the edge of the tree line, sitting on a stump like a man waiting for a bus. He was just watching. I noticed his leg then. His left leg was extended out straight, stiff. The knee looked swollen, even under the thick fur. He had arthritis. I knew the look because I had it in my own knuckles. He wasn't a supernatural monster. He was just an old biological machine that was starting to wear out parts. I went back to mixing the mortar. I worked for 4 hours, and he watched for 4 hours. He didn't come closer, and he didn't leave. It was the first time in 3 days that I didn't feel completely alone. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was companionable, like two guys on a job site taking a lunch break, neither one feeling the need to fill the air with useless chatter. By the end of the week, the pattern was set. I would leave food on the post apples, dye old bread, sometimes a piece of dried venison. It would be gone in the morning. The spot left clean. During the day, while I worked on the property, Solomon would appear. He never came closer than 50 yards. He seemed to understand the boundary of the yard versus the woods. He respected the line, but he was curious about the masonry. I could see him leaning forward when I used the chisel to split a stone. He seemed fascinated by the fact that I could reshape the rock. One afternoon, I was struggling with a particularly ugly piece of granite that wouldn't sit flat. I cursed and threw it aside. Solomon made a low grumble, but he pointed a long finger at a pile of rocks near the creek, then pointed to the wall. He was telling me where to find a better stone. A month into this, the rain stopped and spring really set in. The days got longer. I was sitting on the porch one evening, nursing a coffee, when Solomon stepped out of the woods carrying something. He walked with that heavy, rolling gait, favoring his bad leg. He came right up to the fence post, closer than Eddie ever been, while I was visible. He placed a stone on the post and backed away. I waited until he was back in the shadows before I went to look. It was a piece of basalt, perfectly flat on one side, square cut by nature. It was exactly the size I needed for the corner of the wall I was fixing. He had seen the gap. He had found the plug. I held the stone up, nodding toward the trees. "Thanks," I said, my voice rusty from disuse. From the darkness, I heard a soft huff of air. It was the first time we acknowledged that we were working on this place together. I started leaving the radio on during the day, just a local AM station that played country gold Patsy Cline, Hank Williams, heavy on the steel guitar. I noticed Solomon liked the low notes. When a song with a deep bass line came on, he would sometimes sway slightly, just a shifting of weight. One afternoon, "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry" came on. Solomon was sitting on his stump. As the song played, he started to hum. It wasn't a melody exactly, more of a vibration that I could feel in the floorboards of the porch. A deep, chesty rumble that matched the pitch of the song. He wasn't mimicking the words. He was matching the feeling. He felt the lonesome too. I turned the volume up a little. We sat there, listening to Hank sing about the midnight train. And for the first time since Doris died, I didn't cry. I just let the music fill up the space where her voice used to be. But the silence of our arrangement couldn't keep the world out forever. In late May, a storm blew in off the Pacific. One of those nasty spring gales that knocks down power lines and snaps trees like toothpicks. I holed up in the cabin, feeding the wood stove, listening to the wind howl. Around midnight, I heard a crack that sounded like a cannon shot, followed by a crash that shook the whole cabin. A massive hemlock had come down right across the access road, blocking my only way out. I wasn't worried. I had a chainsaw and plenty of food, but the next morning, when I went out to inspect the damage, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The tree hadn't just blocked the road. It had crushed the corner of the old shed where I kept the tractor. And underneath the branches, trapped in the debris, was a patch of dark, matted fur. Solomon had been seeking shelter in the shed. I dropped the coffee cup. It shattered on the porch steps. But I didn't stop to clean it up. I ran to the shed, my boots sliding in the mud that the storm had churned up. The hemlock had snapped halfway up the trunk, driving the shed's roof down onto the tractor bay. The smell hit me before I got to the door sharp. Musky odor, like a wet dog rolled in pine needles, mixed with the metallic temps of spilled hydraulic fluid. I dropped to my knees in the mud, peering into the gap between the collapsed beams. He was there. Solomon was pinned face down, a 6x6 roof beam pressed across his lower back. He was growling, a low, guttural sound that vibrated in the wet air. But he wasn't moving his legs. The debris had him trapped tight. I didn't think about the danger. If a wounded animal is dangerous, a wounded 7-foot giant is a death sentence. But I just saw a neighbor in trouble. I ran back to the shop side of the shed, which was still standing, and grabbed my heavy-duty floor jack, the one I used for the tractor. I dragged it through the mud, the wheels catching on roots and rocks. I grabbed the chainsaw too, checking the gas level as I ran. When I got back to him, Solomon turned his head, his lips pulled back, showing teeth that were yellow and worn flat, like an old horse's. He said, at me, his eyes wide with panic. I held up my hands, showing him I wasn't holding a weapon. Just a jack. Easy. I wheezed, my chest burning. I'm going to get it off you. I had to crawl into the space with him to set the jack. The space was tight, smelling of rot and wet fur. I could feel the heat radiating off his body. It was like sitting next to a wood stove. I positioned the jack under the main beam, finding a solid purchase on the concrete slab floor. I started pumping the handle. Clickis. Clickis. The hydraulic piston began to rise. Solomon flinched with every metallic click, his muscles bunching up under that dark coat. He could have reached out and snapped my neck with one swipe, but he stayed still. He seemed to understand the mechanics of what I was doing. Or maybe he was just in too much pain to fight. The wood groaned as the pressure increased. I watched the beam slowly lift off his back, inch by agonizing inch. Dust and sawdust rained down on us. When there was about 6 inches of clearance, I shouted, "Move. Pull it out." I don't know if he understood the words, but he understood the lack of weight. He scrambled forward, dragging his legs until he was clear of the collapse. I released the valve, and the beam crashed back down, kicking up a cloud of debris. I scrambled out backward, coughing, wiping grit from my eyes. Solomana was lying in the tall grass about 20 feet away, panting heavily. He was checking his legs, rubbing his massive thighs with his hands. He wasn't broken, bruised, likely, and terrified, but he stood up. He favored his left leg, the one with the arthritis, even more than usual. He looked at me standing there covered in grease and mud, leaning on the jack handle. For a second, I thought he might come over. The distance between us felt non-existent in that moment. We had been in the dirt together. He made a soft, wafting sound, blowing air through his nose, and gave a single, slow nod. It wasn't a bow, it was an acknowledgement. Then he turned and melted into the tree line, moving faster than I thought an injured thing could move. I sat down on the wet grass and let my hands shake. That winter was the hardest one we'd seen in a decade. The snow started in November and didn't let up until April. The drifts were 6 feet high against the north side of the cabin. I spent most of my time indoors, reading old paperbacks and keeping the fire fed. I worried about him. An animal that size needs a lot of calories to keep warm, and with the snow that deep, foraging had to be impossible. I started leaving larger portions on the fence post blocks of suet, 5-pound bags of apples, entire venison roasts. When I had a successful hunt, I'd wake up in the morning and they'd be gone. The snow around the post undisturbed, except for large, dragging tracks that filled up with fresh powder within an hour. In January of 1998, the temperature dropped to 10 below zero. The wind was screaming down the valley, rattling the window panes. I couldn't sleep thinking about him out there in the freezing dark. On a hunch, I put on my parka and waded out to the barn. It was an old structure, separate from the collapsed shed, mostly empty except for some hay I used for garden mulch. I slid the big sliding door open about 3 feet and used a cinder block to wedge it so the wind wouldn't blow it shut. I left it like that, an open invitation. I didn't check it for 3 days. I didn't want to spook him if he was using it. I just kept the house lights off on that side and hoped he had enough sense to come in out of the cold. When the storm finally broke, I went out to the barn. The air inside was still and smelled of dry grass. I climbed the ladder to the loft, my bad knee popping with every step. In the far corner, piled high against the wall where the chimney from the workshop below would radiate a little heat, was a depression in the hay. It was huge, an oval nest about 8 feet long. I knelt down and touched the hay. It was still warm deep down in the center. I found a few long, coarse gray hairs snagged on the dried stalks. He had been there. He had slept under my roof while I slept under mine. I left the barn door wedged open for the rest of the winter. He never acknowledged it, and I never saw him go in. But every morning the hay was matted down fresh. By the early 2000s, we had settled into a rhythm that felt more like a marriage than a haunting. I was in my 70s now, and the heavy work of the property was getting harder. In 2004, I had to go into town for a knee replacement. I was gone for a week. When I got back, I couldn't walk past the porch for a month. I sat there with my leg propped up, watching the forest. Solomon seemed to know I was out of commission. He started coming closer during the daylight hours, sitting on his stump, sometimes for half the day. He had aged, too. His face was almost completely gray now, and he carried a thick branch that he used as a walking stick. We were just two old men with bad joints, watching the trees grow. Our communication had evolved past food. He started bringing me things that weren't useful, but were interesting. One morning I found a piece of quartz on the porch, white and jagged, with a vein of gold pyrite running through it. Another time, it was a perfectly preserved deer skull, bleached white by the sun. But mostly, it was rocks for the wall. He knew I was always patching that stone wall. I think he understood that stacking stone was how I made sense of the world. He would leave river stones, slate, chunks of basalt. I used every single one of them. If you look at the south wall of my property today, you'll see stones that don't belong in that geological area. He must have carried them for miles. I remember one summer evening in 2008, particularly well. I was sitting on the porch, peeling apples for a pie. The radio was playing a bluegrass station, something fast with a banjo. Solomon was at the tree line. I looked up and saw him bobbing his head. He had a piece of wood in his hand, and he was tapping it against his walking stick in perfect time with the music. Tap, tap, tap. It stopped me cold. It wasn't just mimicry. He felt the rhythm. I stopped peeling and just watched him. When the song ended, he tossed the stick away and looked at me. I raised my apple peeler in a salute. He did that slow blink of his, the one that meant he was at ease. We didn't need to talk. The silence was full enough. But you can't keep the world out forever. Not even if you own 60 acres of it. In 2010, the parcel of land next to mine, the one that had been tied up in probate for 20 years, finally sold. I saw the trucks first. Big, lifted pickups with chrome exhaust tips that gleamed like cheap jewelry. Then came the noise, chainsaws, but not the steady work of a logger the revving, aggressive noise of weekend warriors clearing a campsite. The new owner was a man named Randy Siles. He was in his 40s, loud, and wore camouflage gear even when he was just driving to the grocery store. He came over to introduce himself about a week after he bought the place, marching up my driveway without an invitation. "Vern Wright," he shouted before he even got to the porch steps. He had a handshake that felt like he was trying to prove something. "Randy Siles. Just bought the slice of heaven next door. Planning to do some hunting. You seen any big bucks this season?" I looked him over. He had a pistol strapped to his hip and a knife that looked like it belonged in a Rambo movie. I told him I didn't hunt much anymore, just enough to fill the freezer. He laughed, a barking sound that made the birds go quiet. "Well, don't worry, old-timer. I'll keep the population under control. Got some high-tech gear, trail cams, thermal scopes. Nothing gets past me." My stomach turned over. Thermal scopes. If he pointed one of those into the woods at night, he would light Solomon up like a Christmas tree. Solomon was smart, but he didn't know what thermal imaging was. He didn't know that darkness wasn't a shield anymore. I tried to play it cool. "There's not much out here," I lied. "Mostly coyotes and black bear. The deer moved south years ago." Randy winked at me. "That's what they all say. But I saw some tracks down by the creek that didn't look like bear. Look big. Real big." He held his hands apart, measuring a size that was uncomfortably accurate. "You ever see anything strange out here, Vern?" I looked him dead in the eye. I had never lied to a man's face like this in my life. But I didn't hesitate. "I've been here 40 years, I said, my voice flat and hard as slate. "The only strange thing I've seen is city folk getting lost and freezing to death because they thought having a gun made them safe." Randy laughed again, but he took a half step back. I had spooked him. Who's to leave it? But I knew it wouldn't last. As soon as he left, I went to the shed. I grabbed a pair of old snowshoes I hadn't used in years and a roll of heavy burlap. I knew what I had to do. I had to create a ghost to chase the hunter away from the real thing. That night, I didn't sleep. I waited until the moon was down. Then I took the truck and drove 5 miles down the logging road, away from my property and away from Solomon's usual territory. I pulled over and strapped the snowshoes on, then wrapped them in the burlap to blur the print. I spent 3 hours stomping through the mud and brush, making a trail that led straight toward the highway and away from the valley. I broke branches, scuffed trees, made it look like something massive was migrating out of the area. My hip was screaming, and my chest felt like it was full of broken glass. But I kept going. I was 78 years old, creating a hoax to save a friend who could crush me with one hand. It was the only way I knew how to fight back. When I saw Randy a week later, he looked disappointed. "Trail went cold," he grumbled, leaning on my fence. "Followed some tracks down toward the highway, but they just vanished. Must have moved on." I nodded, sipping my coffee, hiding the tremor in my hands. Like I said, "Randy, animals move. They go where it's quiet." He looked to the woods, spat on the ground, and shrugged. "Yeah. But well, I'll keep the cameras up, just in case." He didn't leave, though. He kept coming up on weekends, firing his guns and drinking beer. The sanctuary was broken. Solomon stopped coming to the fence post. The peaches rotted in the jar. We had entered a siege, and we both knew it. The fall happened on a Tuesday in late October of 2015. I remember the day because the Seahawks were playing the 49ers that night, and I was rushing to get the gutters cleaned before kickoff. I was 83 years old, climbing a 20-foot aluminum ladder with a bucket and a trowel. New, bitter. Doris would have tanned my hide for being so stupid. But I was stubborn. I reached too far for a clod of wet maple leaves. The ladder feet slipped on the damp decking, and gravity took over. I didn't see the ground coming. I just felt the impact. It sounded like a dry branch snapping inside a sleeping bag. My right hip shattered. I landed in the rhododendrons, staring up at the gray sky. The air knocked out of me so hard I couldn't even groan. I lay there for an hour. The pain wasn't sharp at first. It was a dull, sickening nausea that radiated from my waist down to my toes. I tried to move, but my leg wouldn't listen. It just flopped there. Useless. I didn't have a cell phone in my pocket. It was on the kitchen counter, charging. I yelled for help a few times, but my voice was thin and weak, absorbed instantly by the dense trees. Randy Siles wasn't up for the weekend, and the nearest other neighbor was 5 miles down the road. I realized with a cold, sinking clarity that this was how it ended. I was going to die of exposure in my own flower bed, covered in rotting leaves, while the Seahawks game played to an empty living room. The cold started to seep up through my jacket. I closed my eyes and tried to think about Doris. Then the birds went quiet. I heard the rhododendron bushes rustling, branches parting with a slow, heavy swish. I opened my eyes, expecting a coyote to come finish the job. Instead, a shadow fell over me. Solomon was standing there. It was broad daylight, maybe 3 in the afternoon. He never came this close to the house when the sun was up. But there he was. He looked down at me, his massive head cocked to the side. He didn't look frightening. He looked concerned, like a grandfather looking at a child who skinned his knee. He knelt down, his knees cracking audibly, and the smell of him washed over me wet wool, pine resin, and something earthy like deep soil. He didn't try to pick me up. He seemed to know that moving me would hurt. Instead, he just sat cross-legged in the dirt beside me. He reached out a hand the size of a catcher's mitt and very gently touched my forehead. His skin was rough, calloused, like 60 grit sandpaper, but his touch was light. It made a low rumbling sound in his chest. It purred that I could feel vibrating against my shoulder. He was staying with me. He was waiting. He knew I was broken, and he knew he couldn't fix it, so he offered the only thing he had: his presence. We sat like that for another hour. The sun started to dip behind the ridge, and the temperature dropped. Solomon shifted his position so he was blocking the wind, acting as a living wall between me and the cold. I must have passed out from the pain, because the next thing I remember was the distant wail of a siren. Sheriff Micho had probably driven by, seen the ladder down, and called it in. Solomon heard it long before I did. He stiffened, his ears twitching. He looked at me one last time, gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze that almost felt like a handshake, and then stood up. He moved silently for something so big, disappearing into the laurel bushes just as the ambulance lights flashed against the trees at the bottom of the driveway. When the paramedics loaded me onto the stretcher, one of them asked, "Were you out here alone this whole time, Vern?" I looked at the crushed grass where Solomon had been sitting. "No," I whispered, the morphine starting to hit. My neighbor was with me. Rahab took 4 months. I was in a facility in Port Angeles, learning how to walk again with a titanium hip and a plastic walker. I hated every minute of it. The food tasted like cardboard, and the nurses treated me like a toddler. All I could think about was the house standing empty. Was the stovepipe leaking? Were the pipes freezing? And where was Solomon? Had he given up on me? When my son finally drove me home in February of 2016, the place looked abandoned. Weeds had taken over the driveway, and the porch was covered in fir needles. I hobbled up the steps, leaning heavily on my cane. The first thing I checked was the fence post. The apple I had left there in October was gone. Of course, rotted away to nothing. That first night back, I couldn't sleep. The silence felt different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of before. It felt hollow. I turned on the porch light and sat in my chair, wrapped in a blanket, waiting. It took 3 nights before he showed up. I heard the familiar dragging step first. Then he stepped into the pool of yellow light. I gasped. He looked terrible. His coat, once thick and dark, was patchy and dull, with skin showing through on his flanks. His ribs were visible. He walked with a severe stoop, leaning heavily on his branch. He looked at me, then looked at the cane in my hand. It made a soft huffing sound and tapped his own stick against the ground. "You too," he seemed to say. "We're both broken now. It hit Mitten harder than the fall had." He was alone, truly alone. For years, I had assumed there might be others, maybe deeper in the park, maybe hiding in the caves. But looking at him now, gaunt and frail, I knew the truth. There was no clan waiting for him. There were no young ones learning how to hide. He was the end of the line. When he died, the history of his people in this valley would die with him. The realization made my chest ache. I wasn't just watching a friend get old. I was watching an extinction. I went inside and brought out a jar of peanut butter and a loaf of bread. I didn't put it on the post. I sat on the steps and held the jar out. He hesitated, then shuffled forward. He took the jar from my hand. His fingers were cold. We spent the next few years dying together in slow motion. That sounds grim, but it wasn't. It was peaceful. The urgency of life had faded. I stopped worrying about the retaining wall. He stopped worrying about hiding from me. By 2020, he was spending most of his days sleeping in the sun at the edge of the yard. I would read the newspaper aloud to him. I told him about the election, about the pandemic, about the world going crazy. He would just blink those amber eyes, chewing on the apple slices I cut for him because his teeth were too bad to bite into them whole. We were two relics from a different time, holding onto the earth for as long as it would let us. The winter of 2023 was wet, a constant, bone-chilling drizzle that turned the world to gray slush. I was 91. My breathing was getting bad fluid in the lungs, the doctor said. Congestive heart failure. I was on oxygen half the time, tethered to a machine that hummed and clicked in the corner of the living room. Solomon stopped coming to the porch in November. At first, I thought it was just the weather. He had stayed deep in the woods during storms before. But November turned into December, and the snow started to stick. And still, there were no tracks, no dark shape at the tree line, no hum when I played Patsy Cline. The silence in the valley grew. Teeth he gnawed at me. I knew he wasn't dead. I would have felt it, but I knew he was close to it. Animals know when the end is coming. They go Hawaii. They find a quiet place where they won't be disturbed. And they wait. I couldn't let him do that alone. I couldn't let him rot in some thicket where Randy Siles might find his bones and put them on eBay. I had a debt to pay. He had sat with me when I was broken in the dirt. I had to do the same for him. On a Tuesday morning, when the fog was thick enough to chew, I made a decision that I knew might kill me. I unplugged my oxygen machine. I put on my heavy boots, which took me 20 minutes to lace up. I grabbed my keys. I drove my old Ford truck up the logging road that ran along the North Ridge. The road was washed out in places. Deep ruts, filled with brown water. The truck bounced and groaned, and every jolt felt like a punch to my kidneys. I drove until the road ended, at a turnaround used by loggers 50 years ago. I got out. The air was thin and cold. I leaned against the truck, gasping, waiting for the spots in my vision to clear. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I had a feeling. Over the years, Solomon had always come from this direction, from the high rocky bluffs that overlooked the strait. I zipped up my jacket, grabbed my walking stick, and stepped off the road into the old growth. I walked for 2 hours. A younger man could have done it in 30 minutes. I had to stop every 50 feet to lean against a tree and wheeze. My heart was flopping around in my chest like a dying fish, but I kept going. I followed the game trails, looking for sign. About a mile in, I found it. A broken branch snapped about 7 feet up. Then a footprint in the mud, faint but unmistakable. It was dragging, the left foot scuffing deep. I followed the track. It led me up a steep incline toward the base of a granite cliff face that rose up like a fortress wall. At the base of the cliff, hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss and ivy, was a fissure, a crack in the rock just wide enough for a large body to squeeze through. I stood before the opening, my legs trembling. I could smell him. He was faint, old and dusty, but it was him. Solomon, I called out. My voice cracked. It's Vern. I'm coming in. I didn't have a flashlight, just a road flare I had grabbed from the truck's emergency kit. I struck the cap. The flare hissed to life, sputtering red sparks and casting a harsh crimson light on the wet rocks. I turned sideways and squeezed into the fissure. The stone was cold against my back. I shuffled forward, the tunnel widening after about 10 feet into a cavern. The air inside was dead still and dry. I held the flare up, and then I saw what he had been hiding from the world for 30 years. The flare sputtered, dripping red magnesium tears onto the damp floor. The light was harsh, throwing long, jittery shadows against the walls. But I could see enough. It wasn't a cave in the geological sense. It was a cathedral of calcium. Bones were everywhere. They weren't scattered or broken. They were arranged along the back wall, stacked in niches that looked like they had been carved out by hand. Were skulls. Dozens of them. Some were small, likely children. Others were massive, thick-browed things that looked like helmets made of bone. Femurs and ribs were stacked in neat cords, like firewood cured for winter. This was a family crypt. This was where they came when the time ran out. Solomon was lying near the center of the chamber, curled on his side on a bed of dried moss that had turned gray with age. He looked small. That's the thing about dying. It shrinks you. The massive shoulders that had lifted a shed roof off his back were slumped and narrow. His breathing was wet and shallow, a rattling sound that echoed off the cold stone. I knelt beside him, the flare hissing in my hand. He opened one eye. It was cloudy, a milky film covering the amber iris. But so may, he didn't try to get up. He just let out a long breath, a sigh that smelled of old pine and decay. He moved his hand, sliding it across the stone floor until his fingers brushed the toe of my boot. He made a noise then, weak and gestured with a trembling hand toward the entrance, the narrow fissure I had just squeezed through. Then he pointed to the pile of loose boulders that littered the slope just outside the opening. He brought his hands together in a clapping motion, then flattened them palm down. He did it again. "Close it," he pointed at me, then at the rocks, then made a smoothing motion with his hand, like a mason troweling wet cement. He knew what I was. He had watched me build walls for 30 years. He knew I understood structure, weight, and how to close a gap. He wasn't just asking for a favor. He was hiring me for one last job. I looked at the bones of his ancestors, then back at him. He was terrified. Not of death, he was ready for that, but of what came after. He knew what men like Randy Siles would do if they found this place. They would come with cameras and sample bags. They would strip this temple down to the bedrock and put his grandmother's skull in a glass case at a roadside museum. He wanted to be sealed in. He wanted the door locked. I nodded, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on my face. "I understand," I croaked. "I'll do it, I promise." He let his hand drop. The tension went out of his frame. He closed his eye. I sat with him for a long time. The flare burned down, scorching my gloves, so I lit another one. I didn't want him to die in the dark. I held his hand, which felt like holding a leather baseball glove that had been left out in the rain cold. Stiff, rough. I talked to him. I told him about Doris. I told him about the time I fell off the roof in '88 and broke my ankle. I told him he was a good neighbor. I don't think he heard me near the end. His breathing changed, the rhythm breaking, the pauses getting longer. In silence. In silence. Then, just silence. The chest stopped rising. The rattle stopped. It was gone. He was just a shape in the red light. Another pile of bones waiting to be stacked. I stood up. My knees popped like gunshots in the quiet cave. I looked at him one last time. "Rest easy, old man," I whispered. I turned and squeezed back out through the fissure into the gray afternoon light. The air outside tasted sweet and cold, like rain. I looked up at the cliff face. Above the opening, there was a shelf of loose granite, a scree slope held back by a few large keystone boulders. It was precarious. Nature was already working on bringing it down. It just needed a push. I limped back to the truck and grabbed the heavy iron pry bar I kept in the toolbox. I had used it to lever stumps out of the ground. Now it would close the tomb. I climbed the slope. It took me 40 minutes to go 50 feet. I was gasping, my vision swimming, my heart fluttering like a trapped bird. I jammed the pry bar under the largest boulder, a chunk of granite the size of a refrigerator that was pinning the rest of the slide in place. I leaned my weight into it. Nothing happened. It was too heavy. I was too old. I sat in the mud, weeping with frustration. I was 91 years old. I was useless. Then I remembered what my father taught me about fulcrums. Give me a lever long enough, and I can move the world. I found a smaller rock, wedged it under the bar to change the angle, and tried again. I put everything I had left into that push. Every year of grief, every lonely night, every ounce of anger at the cancer and the hunters and the time that stole everything from us. I pushed until I felt something tear in my shoulder. The rock groaned. It shifted an inch, then two, then gravity took over. The boulder tipped, sliding forward with a grinding roar. It hit the slope below and triggered a chain reaction. The whole shelf gave way. Tons of rock and dirt poured down the face of the cliff. The sound was deafening. A thunderclap that shook the ground under my boots. Dust billowed up, choking me, turning the world white. When the dust settled, the fissure was gone. The base of the cliff was just a jumble of jagged granite, looking like a natural rockfall that had happened centuries ago. No one would ever know there was a cave behind it. No one would ever find the bones. I stood there in the rain, clutching my pry bar, shaking from exhaustion and shock. I had finished the job. I had built the wall. I dropped the bar in the tall grass and stumbled back to the truck. I don't remember the drive home. I remember waking up in the hospital 3 days later with pneumonia and a shoulder that needed surgery I was too old to have. I'm back in the hospice center now. It's quiet here, except for the beeping of the monitors down the hall. The nurses are nice, but they treat me like I'm senile. They ask me about the piece of slate I keep on my nightstand, the one with the stick figure drawing. They ask if my grandson drew it. I just smile and tell them yes. It's easier than explaining that it was drawn by a creature who understood the geometry of loss better than any human I ever met. That slate was his way of asking for help. He drew the mountain, the box, the figure. He drew his own grave and asked me to be the caretaker. I did one last thing before the ambulance came that day. I didn't just drop the pry bar. I had a pocket full of seeds in my jacket, foxglove seeds. I harvested them from the patch growing on Doris's grave. I scattered them in the dirt at the base of the rock slide, right where the entrance used to be. Come spring, that whole slope is going to be purple. It'll be a garden for him and for his family, a marker that only I know how to read. Randy Siles might walk past it looking for trophies, but he'll never see what's right under his nose. He'll just see rocks and weeds. He won't see the love that buried the dead. I'm tired now. The fluid is creeping up, and it's getting harder to talk. But I'm not afraid. I did my work. The foundation is solid. The wall is plumb. I kept my promise. People talk about these creatures like they're monsters or missing links. They argue about DNA and footprints. They missed the point entirely. Solomon wasn't a puzzle to be solved. He was a neighbor. He was a widower. He was a soul who didn't want to be alone in the dark. We aren't so different. We all just want someone to sit with us when the fire goes out. If you ever find yourself on the North Ridge and you see a patch of foxglove growing where it shouldn't, among the granite slides, don't dig. Don't look for an entrance. Just sit down. Be quiet. Listen to the wind. And know that you're in good company if you believe that some bonds are deeper than biology and that friendship can survive even the silence of the grave. You're welcome here. Join us. Subscribe to the channel. Let's keep the memory alive together.